Ecclesiastes. We're going to be breaking up Ecclesiastes in 3 different segments, 4 chapters each. And so you can read 5, 6, 7, 8 for Wednesday night Bible study, and then the remaining of the book for next Sunday. And we're just going to go through. We're not going to go verse by verse, more kind of paragraph by paragraph, you might say. So hopefully you'll get something good out of the study. We won't be like in Proverbs, bouncing all over the place, trying to hit topical. So a little bit more expository in this particular study. I've asked Dale to lead us in prayer. If you will, bow, please.
Father in heaven, we come before you this morning, recognizing your greatness and your holiness. We praise your name. Be with us this morning as we study your word. Be with Darrell as he presents his material. We're thankful for your word, for this opportunity we have to gather with fellow saints to serve you. Remember your Son, Jesus Christ, and his death on the cross. We ask you to be with our worship this morning, our songs, our prayers. May they be lifted up on high to you. Thank you for all those that are in attendance and for the teachers that have prepared today. Be with our hearts, and may they be open to your word. In Jesus' name we pray.
Yeah. All right, we're just going to do a little bit of background, you might say, on Solomon. The author, of course, is Solomon, chapter 1, verse 1. There's debate about it, but why? I don't know. To support this, Solomon has great wisdom in chapter 1, verse 16, extensive building projects and so on. We'll talk about that in a moment. Chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, incomparable wealth in verses 7 through 9. And then the mention of many proverbs in chapter 12 and verse 9. Written in 940. And so the name of the book, translated literally in English, would be The Preacher. This is in verse 1, 2, and then verse 12, chapter 7, verse 27, chapter 12, verses 8, 9, and 10. And so the name of the book, I found this to be a little interesting. Ecclesiastes derives its name from the preacher named in the book. And then the Koheleth was an official speaker to an assembly of people. So it is the preacher, the speaker, keynote speaker, we might use in our terminology. So when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, this book was given the name Ecclesiastes. You'll see it's with the K's rather than the C's. And then it was transliterated into what we have today as the Ecclesiastes, the ECC rather than EKK. I don't know why. What do you catch, though, which is kind of interesting? What do you catch in that word, Ecclesiastes, that we would find in the Greek? Ecclesia, right? Yeah, so that's pretty unique, called out. Again, ecclesia is not spiritual as far as a word is concerned. You can confirm this in Acts chapter 19. There was an ecclesia that was gathered, and it was a mob. And so there's not the context determines whether it's God's called out, but not in every circumstance, such as I mentioned in Acts chapter 9. But it is interesting. So here you have a man who could pursue any endeavor of his liking, and he did. What is his conclusion? It's all waste. Okay, I've called these the bookends, and it is the beginning of the book and then the end of the book. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. What does vanity mean? Empty. All is vanity. Now, is that true? You and I make some, I forget what the word for it is, but when we say you never, the never, always, it's inclusive, right? So is he saying everything is worthless and empty? I mean, absolutely everything? Thomas?
From what I gather from reading it, read it all the times, it means everything in this life is vanity until you be married, fear of God. That's what the conclusion of the book is, because he talks about it.
Kinda. Right, we'll get to that. You're kind of combining two verses at the same time. So, okay, Dolly and then Joel.
It's only vanity if God's not in it.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely going to be the conclusion to that. Yes, sir.
You get hung up in statistics and numbers and things like that, but this was pretty significant because the word vanity or meaningless is found 37 times in this book, and under the sun is found 27 times.
So the significance is like in this life, it's not this life that really contains it all for us. It's the life to come, but we better be prepared for the life to come here. Yeah. Okay, so what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? And so the ending, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. And this is the part, it doesn't say eat, drink, and be merry, and then so it's fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So this is really the preparatory. This is the preparation for what? What are we toiling for? What's this life of preparation for?
Eternity.
Eternity. Right. Forever and ever. All right. So that's what I call the bookends, and this is where what your statement would ring true, Thomas. This is the meat of it, and interjecting God in this whole concept. So Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 24 and 26, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment more than I? And why would he be able to ask that rhetorical question? He had it all. Right. So we'll be emphasizing that. In verse 26, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. In chapter 3, verses 12 and 14, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That fear before him thrown in there really changes the concept here of just eat, drink, and be merry. Live it up, right? And there's no consequence. This says otherwise. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 18 and 19, here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, because there is that idea of Proverbs where you go and labor and labor and labor, and then you don't even get to enjoy it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. What do you pull from these? These are cherry picked, but this is where you're going to find God intertwined in this concept of our existence, our labor under the sun, and so on. What do these three passages help us to understand?
That God is the root of it all,
Okay, God's the root of all.
that he is the reason for all,
Okay.
and the hope of it all. So
Okay. Yes, sir. Bill?
To me, what Solomon is saying in these three passages is there's a lot of things about life here upon this earth that are either meaningless or they're not fulfilling. That's the reason why God would tell us elsewhere in the Psalms, this is the day the Lord has given us. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. So despite the fact that life here is difficult and seemingly worthless, empty, we still need to recognize that each day of life is a gift from God, and we need to make the best out of it.
All right, very good. We've all heard, go ahead.
I was thinking of the idea that, not to negate anything anybody said, but the idea that as long as you understand that everything that you have is a gift from God, whether it's the toil that you labor and everything that you have, that's how you can enjoy, eat, and drink, be merry. Otherwise, you're doing it in vain because you're not giving glory to God. You're not acknowledging that He has given this to you.
Right. We've all heard the terminology, that idea that if you what you find yourself doing and you enjoy it, you'll never work a day in your life. I know I added to that. How does that go? Do y'all know that? You know the phrase.
How you enjoy, you'll never work a day in your life, something like that.
Okay. So when it comes to our spiritual warfare, our spiritual struggles, our spiritual trials and tribulation and hardships and the fight against our adversary, is there any joy in that? Is there any joy in laboring for something for a reward at the end? Reward in the Bible is both good and bad. You can reward those, heaven, and you can reward hell. So keep that in mind. But my point is that as you're living your life, do you find yourself just torn down, or do you see an end? Can we become short-sighted? And the worst thing about life is it's day in and day out. Calvin?
Kind of concluded, I like what Peter says, He gives us all things pertaining to life and godliness. So self-love would be people, they don't do. You learn about things that yourself, know something.
Sure.
Okay, right?
Right.
That's one of the things that you work or whatever, you're going to learn something about it.
So is there, when you get to the end of the day, there's some days, that's a very short period, you might say, and you're like, okay, I didn't get anything accomplished. Those days happen. But as an overall, we hope that we're beginning and we're ending tasks, right? Not only are we not procrastinating, but we're not just wall to wall. If you find yourself in this life just laboring, and not receiving a reward, not getting any satisfaction at the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month, the end of your life, then it was in vain. And so he's saying that there should be some enjoyment. So can we have our nose to the grinding stone so hard in the kingdom, forget your work life and so on, but in the kingdom, can we have it so, we're so driven that we cannot find the joy in it? And it's the weariness. So we have to be careful about that. Whether it's in the workforce, in the family, there needs to be some of that enjoyment time.
Yeah.
There needs to be some time that you can stop and reflect, and that you can rest, that you can get some respite. We're not going to turn to the passages, but because I got a lot more that I'm wanting to cover. But did Jesus do that, or was he just constant? He was so constant that he and the apostles couldn't eat. But then there came a time, okay, we've got to back off, and we need to, relax a little bit. Now, then you go too much, the little folding of the hands, right, and the sluggard. So there's that happy balance. And so I think that what's being expressed here with these passages is that God does not want us just to labor so hard. We got to work, that we can't have any kind of enjoyment from the fruit of our labors. Okay, I got a bunch of hands. Jean, Jesse.
Well, I just think it's interesting that in the beginning, God started with a day of rest.
He worked, and then rested, right?
He did, and then he instituted it.
Right.
For us, so God put that into the whole plan at the beginning.
Right, so let's not complain about working for 5 days a week and only having. Okay, Anise?
Yeah, I think, it doesn't matter what you're doing, that you're laboring, and when you lose sight of God,
Right.
everything that you do is weariness. And even having fun can be weariness when you lose sight of God.
Yeah, and he's given us this work. It's good for man to work. It's not good to sit around and do nothing. Jesse?
David struggled a little bit. He put it in perspective in Psalm 51, where he says, "Return to me the joy of my salvation." And that comes first, and then he can turn to teach others his ways.
Yeah, very good. Thomas?
Talk about work. I did that for about 7 years, driving a semi-truck. And you will get burnt out. And you even despise the fact you're even working, because you just can't, it's just so much. Then if you're not getting any return on it, it makes it just seem like all you're doing is just working for the sake of working. And it really is, it's burned me out, it's upset me. It's caused me some problems that I wish it didn't happen, but that is the result of that.
Yeah, and we should have joy in our labor because of working, the capability, and then, that reward in the end. We're going to have to move on. Calvin?
Now, if you really want to get, I don't know if you call it extreme, but Jesus took a nap in the middle of the storm. I mean, how much peace can you have and not worry about anything? If you can take a nap, and they have to wake him up and the disciples don't keep telling you not to.
Yeah. He was in
That's awesome.
in the flesh, and he was fatigued, and right, he understands. So in chapter 1, we'll notice Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 3, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? We need to be careful regarding our motivation. Turn over to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 26. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 26, we read there, "For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" So we can labor for that which will cost us rather than, give us some profit, if you will. So, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? What's the answer to that question? Let's see, let me get it up there for you. Brendan? Nothing? It depends on your perspective, right? Can't take it with you. So if it's all about this world, in which y'all have done very, very good about making a distinction about living for God, and so all these other things just fall into their place. But if you're only living for this life, you're living for yourself. What are you gonna lose? Your soul. If you forsake yourself and live for your soul, in other words, living for God, then what do you have? You have everything. And so, what is the evidence there is nothing new under the sun? Because, how far has technology come along since Solomon? That's crazy. So what is he referring to here, Thomas?
I think he even says it inside, I think it's even written in Ecclesiastes. Each group, each generation has their own problems that they have to deal with. Nothing is new under the sun. It's all happened once before, it'll happen again, and it'll keep happening in basically a vicious cycle. Doesn't matter how advanced the civilization is or how stone age the civilization is. It's going to have its own challenges.
Right. Turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. And we'll notice there that one of the challenges of Ecclesiastes is determining, okay, what is he talking about? Is he talking about this life under the sun, or is he talking about eternal life? And making that distinction as you go through. There is not an umbrella that fits all, that all fall under, if you will. So in chapter 3 and verse 11, we read there, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. I think another way to put that is we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so our life is but a what? A vapor. So where should our focus be?
Today.
Eternal. And what can I do today? I can't do anything about tomorrow. Calvin?
Yeah, this is good. One thing about it, even whether it's computers, AI, Bitcoin, I don't care what you think is new. All you're doing is reforming something that God has already created. It's been there, been created. You just now discovered some things about God that has always existed.
Right. And this is the spiritual side of it. Notice in verse 15, that which is has already been, and what is to be has already been.
Yeah.
And God requires an account of what is past. That's a mouthful, at least for me, maybe not for you. There's nothing new under the sun. And man is still man. This world still spins. You know, people die, more are born, and they die. And you see that cycle. And it just repeats itself. And we're just that blip on the radar at best if you live to be 100 years old. Dale?
I always think of my kids when you think of there's nothing new under the sun, because they love, not necessarily my kids, but a lot of teenagers. Oh, you don't understand my problem. And I think when you're talking about there's nothing new under the sun, there's no new problem. Our temptations are the same, our worries, our stressors, they've always been there, they always will be.
Right. Yeah. It's life, right? That's life. Okay, so what did Solomon's great wisdom achieve? Verses 12 through 18, going back to chapter 1, we jumped out there for just a little bit. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under the sun, in this life, in other words, right? This grievous task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. Afflicted could be another word there. And so you cannot, notice in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight. You know, there's always going to be good and bad. We're not going to solve world hunger. We're not going to solve homelessness. There are people who choose that for themselves, and they don't want a house, if you will. Those things are going to happen. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained, this is verse 16, gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge, and I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is grasping for the wind. In other words, you couldn't get enough. You can't be satisfied with it. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. I don't know if there's a connection or not, but it makes me think of that person who has knowledge in whatever it is, and guess what? They're going to use you, right? And that's good. You know, we're happy to use our talents and resources and abilities and so on, and that's great. But at the same time, if you have that ability, boy, you could really be put to the test. And so, wisdom can be detrimental. I used to love leading singing. I don't so much anymore. I make myself, but and I want to, but I know now every time I mess up, and I'm very, very, very self-conscious, and I think I'm gonna mess everybody up because I missed one note, that type of thing. When I was younger, do you remember those days? You couldn't do anything wrong. So wisdom can be great if it's used properly, but then, wisdom can kind of hold you back sometimes, and it caused people, like was a comment, I don't know who made it a while ago, almost to shut down. I think, that fatigue that you were talking about, Thomas, maybe that idea you get burned out. And so there's a lot of different concepts. So why is much wisdom, much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow? Why is that? Well, I think that's what's being expressed here in 16 and 17, is that sometimes the more you know, the more accountable you are.
Yeah.
Right? That kind of...
Yeah, same idea. The more you know your own failings.
Right.
But also, like, when you talk about increasing knowledge, I mean, this is us. Like, we talk about, our ability to access knowledge and what's going on in the world, and we can find out anything, anytime, in a way that nobody has ever been, and yet in reality, sometimes that knowledge is good, but a lot of times that knowledge just increases sorrow because you're learning about how awful the world is.
Right.
And we have access to a non-stop flow of awfulness in the world at our fingers every second, and it's very tough to deal with, and part of wisdom is understanding we need to shut that off a lot because it makes life hard to understand what's going on.
I haven't watched the news in at least a year. Maybe in happenstance, maybe a smidgen, definitely since we've been here since March. We haven't even had a TV. And so I don't know what's going on. I hear about these tariffs, and so I don't know anything. I know what a tariff is, and I know how that works and so on. So I hear these people having a conversation about this and that, but it's just these smidgens, and I'm like, well, don't know nothing about that, so I'm, woo. I have no problems. There's a balance, though. We're not helping ourselves in some circumstances to not know the troubles that are, going on, if you will. Candace?
I look at this and I actually have a perspective. It might be completely different than wrong. But when you have knowledge, you know the difference between good and bad.
Right.
And then you look at the world. And the sorrow comes when you look at the world and you see that it's more bad than good stuff. And it makes you sad,
Sure. Yeah, and so we could spend a lot of time on that. Let's move on, chapter 2. So what does Solomon pursue to find happiness? And so he pursues laughter in verse 2, drunkenness in verse 3, houses in verse 4, vineyards, garden, orchards, and fruit trees in verses 4 and 5, water pools and irrigation in verse 6, male and female servants in verse 7, and also herds and flocks. Then we see in verse 8 the accumulation of wealth, silver, gold, and special treasures, whatever they were, right? Antiques, collectibles, music. How many people are caught up in music or the arts today, right? And so how limited was Solomon in his pursuits? Yeah. Right. In chapter 2, beginning in verse 9, so I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. In other words, he didn't lose his mind in the process. That's the way I conclude that statement. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. So, have you ever gone through that cycle? There's some kind of new interest, whatever it is. Yes, sir. William?
I was about to say.
No, William. Right behind you, Thomas.
I just wanted to know, God says that he will destroy
the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. What does that mean?
It's the idea that they know more than God, that they themselves have the answers of life. And so they don't need God to give them any kind of direction, instruction, and so on. And so God laughs at them pretty much, and he's going to put them in their place. And they're going to find out that they are not the all-knowing that they suppose they are.
Are you talking about the know-it-alls?
Well, it could be. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thomas?
I was thinking about what you said. Sounds like when I'm going through that Solomon was living like a spoiled rich kid
Well,
at this point.
so have you ever gone through that cycle, whether you're a woodworker or the golfer, some sport, or knitting, or, whatever that craft may be, and boy, you're just all in, and then there comes a time where you kind of lose some interest and something else pops up. He could do anything he wanted, and from one interest to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and not only that, but he had the wisdom to be able to pursue it in almost in perfection, is the way I read it. That idea that nothing withheld, and if there was someone who could really teach him, he's going to be able to grab a hold of that and even, excel the one who would give him some instruction in that regard. I mean, in other words, he not only is he not withheld as far as financial to be able to pursue it, but he also has the wisdom that combines immediately from the get-go. That's awesome. Because some of us might have an interest in something, but we're not very good at it. We try and we're just not very good. This guy had it all together, you might say. Calvin?
On the positive side, even the prophets didn't know everything. And people went along, they were looking for a certain type of king. And they didn't understand Jesus Christ. When Jesus Christ came along, he put all that stuff no, that's the positive side of it. We talked about the negative side. The positive side, even they didn't know it.
Yeah. All right, so what was Solomon's conclusion to this matter? In verse 11, there's quite a few conclusions. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for wind. There was no profit under the sun. Again, under the sun really does qualify this idea of here on earth. In other words, what's the end of the knitting and what's the end of the woodworking? What's the end of the career? You're going to be dead. You're going to leave the stuff to someone else. I mean, it really is. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't have any enjoyment, you couldn't have any pleasure, you couldn't have any satisfaction while doing it in the end, right? And there's good that comes from it. But ultimately, in the whole scheme of things, spiritually speaking, means nothing. And boy, could we run with that. Okay, so why did Solomon hate his life, his labor, and found it to be distressing? Let me see. Where did I leave off in my notes here? We're running out of time. Yeah, that's the second question. How are fools and the wise so different, yet both have the same ends? You could be the wisest person in the world, and you could be the most foolish, and what's going to happen to them? They both die. Your wisdom didn't save you from death, and this guy being really, really foolish, he's still dead too. Okay, so this idea of this distressing, he concludes in verse 17 that it is vanity and grasping for wind. In verse 18, all he had worked for, he must leave to the man after him. Verse 19, Solomon had been wise, but will his successor be wise or a fool? What's he going to do with all of his hard work, in other words? Right? So Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 22, for what has man for all his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? What's that rhetorical question? How's that answered? In 19 through 21, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, talking about the successor. yet he will rule over all my labor. He might not have put a dime in it. He might not have put one drop of sweat, no blood, no tears, and it's just handed to him, right? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toil and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart to despair of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage, and that was certainly Solomon, to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. But who doesn't want to be this child that everything's handed to him? I started a business from scratch. Nothing. I didn't even have an education. I didn't go to school. And I started a business in an industry I knew nothing about. I understand that. And so here's a guy that does that, and he hands it over to his son who doesn't care and has no risk. And what happens to that business oftentimes? Not every time. And so here you are at the end of your life, and you're thinking, okay, I have $500,000 in the bank, house is paid for, cars are paid for, no debt, I have a business, and you're just going to hand it over to someone. How does that make you feel? And we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to make the spiritual application. What has God given you and me? And he says, what are they doing with it? I gave my son. I've given them, as Calvin alluded to earlier, in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, all things that pertain to life and godliness. What are they doing? Right? Could you see the frustration of God in regard to us being the ones who are inheriting salvation? Salvation, eternity, no less, which far outweighs any big bank account, a place to live, all the clothes you could ever want to buy, you name it. We're Solomon. And oftentimes we're Solomon both spiritually and physically. We have tons of luxury that we just, frankly, expect, take for granted, and so on. So that's our challenge. And I believe that that's where he's coming from. So Solomon's conclusion then is to eat, drink, enjoy the fruit of your labor, verses 24 through 26. There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. Do you ever get caught up in wondering, you got more month than, or you got more bills, however you want to say, you got more month than you do money, right? And have you ever stressed over that? Somehow you get through it. And then, but whenever you face it again, it's like it's never happened before. It's the first time ever in your life, and you're just stressing. And we go through those cycles, and we need to be reminded that this life is not all. But boy, we can stress over it. We can really lose some sleep over this life. And I do believe that affects our spiritual life, our spiritual walk. And Solomon's saying, don't get caught up in this life so much that you lose your focus on what's really, really important. We're going to have to move on, Calvin. I am so sorry. I got another chapter in 5 minutes because of what I have done to myself. So in chapter 4, there is a time for opposites, Let's see. No. Hey. I'm going to click through all these. Hopefully you've already read it. You know, the beginning and the end, right? Oops. So you can take a look at those. It's not necessarily in the order going, it does say birth and death, but it may be pluck up and plant, you know, that kind of thing. And this is that process of time. This is that, again, there's nothing new under the sun. It's the same thing over and over and over and over, right? Okay, so God will judge. We will be accountable. So what happens to man, that happens to the animals. Yet what is different? The soul, or it says the spirit, not the soul. The spirit of the animal goes where? Down. And the soul of man, the spirit of man goes to God. So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? You can't. You just don't know the end of all of your labor, really. How should this motivate us? We already dealt with that on the spiritual side. And so in chapter 4, the oppressed have no comforter. What is Solomon's conclusion in that regard? We'll see in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Is someone already there? Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed. Well, he wouldn't even be a he, right? Who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. There may be that conclusion that was expressed earlier. I've gone by the graveyard quite a few times and wishing I was there. You ever, I'm a weirdo though, when it comes to death. I'm ready, sign me up. There's a bus out there, I'm gone. Lord Jesus, come. That's what I say. Because to me, that's the ultimate goal. We're not going to live forever. There's always something to live for, but to die is the gain, right? And so we can get too caught up. A man suffers in life in one skill. In addition, he is envied by his neighbor there in verse 4. And so what is the end of the oppressor? He oppresses the good. His idle living is off of wickedness there in that context. The tormentor is ultimately self-consumed. And so we need to be content. Jesus says in Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. If you're working overtime, what are you working overtime for? You giving it to the Lord? You helping someone out? Or is it to accumulate things? We've got to be careful about that. I don't know, it mentioned this morning about hoarders, right? Why do we accumulate these? I told Dolly, I said, we need to invest in some land and go put some storage units on it, because people have a 2,000 square foot house and they can't keep all their stuff, and so they got the overflow. You can't take it with you. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6, now godliness with contentment is great gain. For you brought nothing into this world, and certainly you can carry nothing out. There's two things that you and I need to understand, right? Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. He doesn't say anything about a big house, a new car. He didn't even talk about a roof over your head. Food and clothing. When Jesus is talking about that in Matthew chapter 6, those are the only two he mentions too. You don't talk about a roof over your head. One of the wealthiest men that ever lived didn't have a roof over his head, and I said he had a tent, right? So we need to be careful about the pursuit of riches. And I wanted to elaborate on that in the workaholic there in verse 8 of chapter 4, and then the power of two, and how he combines these, this concept of they have a good reward, they have help, being able to help one another when the other falls. they can stay warm, and they can defend one another. I'm so sorry. I've got to keep apologize every study that we just don't have time to cover everything. And also the conclusion of chapter 4 is very interesting. Did anyone do any study about that? They conclude that this is talking about from 13 to 16 about Abraham. No? Okay. Well, I will work harder. I appreciate your comments, though.
It's empty.